When we talk about the de-Westernization of Israeli society, Israeli culture, Israeli politics, and within the context of that de-Westernization, we talk about the unnegation of the diaspora. We're really asking what I think is a fundamental and very, very difficult and very painful question. After the Enlightenment in the 18th and 19th centuries, it perhaps seemed clear to the vast majority of Jews living in the Western world that there were Western solutions to Jewish problems. Western solutions to Jewish problems meant buying into the post-Enlightenment liberal philosophy that dominated the Western world, both in terms of its categories of truth, its categories of how we're supposed to live together as a community, its whole framework of thinking. And there's no doubt that when we talk about the state of Israel, we're talking about a Western state that emulates and copies this orientation of the West. And that's the thing that we have to think deeply about. Are there Western solutions to Jewish problems? Are Western solutions solving our economic problems? Are they solving our political problems? Are they solving the conflict that we're embroiled in and that we're engaged in? And perhaps most deeply, are they allowing us to fulfill what is special and what is unique about the life of the Jewish collective in the land of Israel? If you say that there are Western solutions to Jewish problems, you're basically arguing that the conflict between the Jews and the West, which was thousands of years long, came to an end. And if you want to say that it came to an end in the Enlightenment, and that that's relevant today, you have to say that the resolution of that conflict survived the Holocaust. Which means that what happened in Nazi Germany does not undo and discredit everything that happened since the Enlightenment, and that the continued relationship between the Jews and the West, in which the Jewish world says there are Western solutions to Jewish problems, still stands after Nazism comes onto the stage of history. Now, there are many, many 20th century thinkers who really called this issue into question and who raised very, very fundamental concerns about the possibility of emulating Western society, culture, and politics after the Holocaust, and who felt very deeply that there was a need not just for a deep reevaluation of Western values inside Western civilization, but for a deep reevaluation of the relationship between Jews and the West because of what happened in Western civilization when Nazism raised its head. Now, a number of these are thinkers who really turned very critically on the West. Derrida, for example, and the whole movement of deconstruction is an example. Foucault, who was part of that movement, is another example. And there's a small cluster of Jewish thinkers, many of whom are technically speaking survivors of the Holocaust, although they were, for the most part, leading intellectuals and managed to get out in 1938 and 1939, and some of them even earlier, but who had been born into the Europe that turned into a bloodbath, made it out, and started to ask themselves very, very fundamental questions about what we think as Jews about our new relationship, new being 150, 200 years old, but still new relationship in which we are in cultural, political, and value-based alliance with the West. One of these thinkers is a really unpopular man by the name of George Steiner. And George Steiner, I think, he's a literary critic and a philosopher. And in his work, he's called into question this whole notion of what is the relationship between Judaism and the West. He's called into question the idea, and this is painful, that the good side of the Second World War breakdown. You know, you've got the Germans and their allies, and you've got the British and the Americans and their allies. And he's called into question the very notion that one side remained faithful to the Enlightenment values with which Jews can live, and the other side went wrong. And he has suggested that something on a civilizational scale went wrong, and that the British and that the Americans and the Allied side of the Second World War, they have to ask themselves very, very deep questions about what was right and what was wrong in Western civilization, the civilization that they participate in and which they happen to be on the right side of in the context of a conflict that implicated them all. That's a revolutionary perspective and a very troubling and very difficult one. And you can imagine that as a scholar who spent most of his career in America and Britain, George Steiner was not very popular. But he wasn't popular with Jews either, because for the vast majority of Jews, the idea of building a Western state in the land of Israel, that was the solution. That was the conclusion from the Holocaust. After the Holocaust, we need a state. And Steiner kind of comes along and says, look at what this state is capable of achieving. Look at the First World War. Look at the Second World War. Look at the bloodbath of conflict that states produce. And now Jews want one too? We're past that, was his image. He's not the only Jewish thinker to say this. Ravidovich, Dubnov, and others have raised the idea that the Jewish people moved past the need for a state by creating, for some of them it's more spiritual, for Steiner it's more intellectual and cosmopolitan, but a collective form of living that needs less political infrastructure to hold it together. And that moving past the idea of state is what's really Jewish, and regressing back to the state is to turn the evolution of the Jewish spiritual identity into reverse gear and to set us significantly back. And on these grounds, Steiner, from what I think could be said as a very Jewish perspective, and a deep commitment to peace, by the way, finds himself taking an anti-Zionist position. Now, he raises these questions in a very, very provocative and very, very painful way in an absolutely remarkable little book. I'm going to hold it up so as you can see it clearly. It's called The Portage to San Cristobal of A.H. Here's the title of the book, George Steiner, The Portage to San Cristobal of A.H. Unlike everything else that Steiner has written, this book is actually a novel. It's a philosophical novel, it's not a light read, but it tells what looks like an action story. The story is essentially a fiction, of course, and it's set in the 1950s. And the background of the story is that somehow the death of Adolf Hitler, A.H. in the title is Adolf Hitler, the death of Adolf Hitler was a cover-up. And he didn't really die, and he manages to make his way to South America where he hides out. And the setting of the book, the premise of the book is that Mossad agents are sent on a mission to capture Adolf Hitler and bring him to this place, San Cristobal, where he's going to stand trial. The narrative of the book deals with the cover-up and it deals with the different characters, but essentially there were three major moments in the book. One major moment in the book is when you have a sense of the fear of Hitler, that the characters who capture him, as he's already an old man and he's sick, but there's a sense that this man has the power to speak, and in his speech he can do tremendous damage. With his speech he can do tremendous damage. And really the highlight, one of the big highlights of the book, is a radio message given by the commander of the Mossad unit that's tracking him down to the people who are holding him, saying, "Don't let him speak. He has a tongue it's the fiery tongue of Satan. Don't let him speak." And he tells story after story of terrible things that happened in the Holocaust, as he conveys this image of don't let this man speak because his speech causes this kind of destruction. And it's important to bear that in mind, because that for Steiner is really the message of the book. But for his critics, people have been perhaps disturbed by the book, because having given us this very, very powerful warning against the power of Hitler's speech, Steiner finishes the book with a speech. Hitler is allowed to defend himself. And perhaps it would have been less controversial if Hitler had spoken in the middle of the book and the warning against his speech would have been the final message. And Steiner himself said later on, "My key point was don't let him speak." All the same, what you're left with is the very, very disturbing speech that Hitler gives at the end of the book. Chapter 17 is dedicated to Hitler's speech. And in his speech, he makes 3 points. Erster Punkt, the first point, Article 1. Now here's just a short excerpt from point 1, but it gives us a taste of what he's saying. Because you must understand that I did not invent. It was Adolf Hitler who dreamt up the master race, who conceived of enslaving inferior peoples. Lies. Lies. It was in the Doss House, in the Mannerheim that I first understood. It was in, God help me, but that was long ago. And the lice, large as a thumbnail, 1910, 1911. What does it matter now? It was there that I first understood your secret power. The secret power of your teaching, of yours. A chosen people, chosen by God for His own. The only race on earth chosen, exalted, made singular among mankind. It makes the skin crawl. It's chilling. What is Hitler saying? Hitler said, you want to know where I got my ideas from? You want to know what this was all about? This master race, this motherland, this fatherland, this superiority of a people who's chosen to lead the world towards its destiny? Where did I get this idea from? What are you blaming me for? I got it straight from you. It comes straight out of the Bible. Point number 2. There had to be a solution. A final solution. For what is the Jew if he's not a long cancer of unrest? Gentlemen, I beg your attention. I demand it. Was there ever a crueler invention? A contrivance more calculated to harrow human existence than that of an omnipotent, all-seeing, yet invisible, impalpable, inconceivable God? Now here I need to develop this a little bit, but I want to develop the first and the second points by getting to the common ground between them. In point 1, in which Hitler says, I learned the idea of the chosen people from you. And in point 2, you guys gave us God. Hitler is trying to explain why the Jews needed to be eradicated. The Jews need to be eradicated because they claim to be a chosen people. I got that from you. And if it's not you, then you have to be displaced. You have to be taken off that throne. You have to be taken off that pedestal. But why take you off that pedestal? Take you off that pedestal because you are responsible for the most cruel act in the history of humanity. You invented a God that no one can see, that no one can feel, that no one can touch, and that everybody, and who sets standards that are inconceivably high, and that everybody has to live up to. That is an act of torture. And so, says Hitler, it wasn't just enough to displace you from your pedestal and destroy your people. I had to destroy your God as well. And elsewhere in Steiner's writings, he develops this idea. He refers to it as the blackmail of the transcendent, which is the setting of a standard that nobody can live up to. And to set that standard that nobody can live up to is to demand of humanity to make the world into heaven. And if the world cannot be heaven because we're only human beings, the redemption of the world from the burden of being a heaven is to build hell on earth. What does hell look like? Hell looks like Auschwitz. Hell is burning fires. Hell is death, sickness, destruction, the stripping of people of their identity. The construction of an image, a spiritual, religious image of hell on earth is the redemption of humanity from the yoke of living up to the standards that the Jewish people have forced us to deal with and which nobody can handle. I got it from you. Gentlemen of the tribunal, I took my doctrines from you. I fought the blackmail of the ideal with which you have hounded mankind. Many crimes were matched and surpassed by those of others. The Reich begat Israel. These are my last words. The last words of a dying man against the last words of those who suffered and in the midst of incertitude must matter to be left till the great revelation of all secrets. Steiner, remember this isn't really Hitler. Steiner puts into Hitler's mouth 3 claims. Number 1, you guys had to be displaced. Number 2, your God had to be displaced. Number 3, I don't know what you're complaining about. If it wasn't for me, you wouldn't have your state of Israel. I made it happen for you. You need to be grateful. Now, if we're to summarize this in the really short amount of time that we have available, we can grapple here with the intensity of Steiner's criticism of the notion of a nation state, the notion of the Jewish people building a nation state, essentially as the fulfillment of the fantasy that Hitler has, which is Jewish secularization, taking the Jewish people away from the standard of God and leaving the rest of the world free from the burden of God. Taking the Jewish people off their pedestal, a nation like all other nations, with all the problems that everybody else has, and a nation that has no choice but to include in its history the notion that the Holocaust bequeathed to them the opportunity to become the collective that they are today. If there is ever a fierce criticism of the extent to which the Zionist movement and the fulfilling of Zionist history suckled its inspiration from the gifts bequeathed to it by the culture of the West, if there was ever a criticism of it, this is it.